All right, so this was allopatric speciation. So think of a geographic barrier. The population is separated somehow, and there's genetic diversity that's going to happen, genetic divergence. So allopatric versus, sorry. So allopatric speciation, Galapagos finches, an example. Like here's the mainland finch. Here are the Galapagos Islands. Here are the different finches on the different islands. And they're similar. I'm going across the Galapagos. Blah. Okay. They're similar, yet they're different. And they're on islands, so there's geographic barriers. Here's Ecuador, the mainland. Okay. Now, this one is difficult to understand, but once you see it, you're like, oh, I got it. Okay. This is called sympatric speciation. So think the organisms are in the same place, okay? And speciation is going to happen. Now, how does that happen? Let's say sympatric speciation, it says results in reproductive isolation that coexist in the same area. So sympatric, two scenarios. Let's say fertilization happens. Let's say when there's gamete reproduction, something goes wrong, there's an error, and then the new individual has extra chromosomes and survives. Now you got a brand new individual, right? So same thing here, fertilization, and there's a hybrid and you get a new individual. So in plants, this actually happens, rather common, where in the same area, fertilization, and then bam, we have an organism with double the chromosome number, and now you have a new species. So sympatric. So polyploidy. Poly means many. Error during cell division in plants. Chromosomes are duplicated, but a cell does not divide. This doubling of number of sets, chromosome polyploidy. And then the individual now has 4 sets, can no longer interbreed with the individuals having only 2 sets. Plants can self-fertilize, right? Plants, remember the flower has the male and female part? So they can self-fertilize, and now, bam, you got a new species, okay? Mating with other individuals that have 4 sets can occur. Instant reproductive isolation considered a new species. So plants are really neat. You know, even though plants don't move around like animals do, plants are fun, right? My glasses, I'll just take those off because the light. Anyway, yeah, they're fun, right? So sympatric. So speciation, creating new species. How can that happen? Can happen with allopatric, think of geographic barrier, and isolation, and then genetic divergence, or sympatric, where it happens in the same place and somehow there's isolation, okay? So speciation is the process by which one species splits into 2 that are reproductively isolated. It can occur by polyploidy or by combination of reproductive isolation. So now moving on to the diversity of life. We can think of all living things and how they're connected with one another. You can think of it as the tree of life, okay? If this is the tree of life, down here would be like the first organism, right? The most ancient ancestor. And then out here would be all the species that are around today, okay? And if you look at the branches, like these would be species that are related, that are closely related to one another, versus these species would be closely related versus this. So we have trees, evolutionary trees, where we see the relationship between one species and another, and the ancestral species. So evolutionary trees help us conceptualize, categorize biodiversity. The history of life can be imagined as a tree. Systematics, names, arranges species, the common ancestors they share, the points which there's divergence if there's new species. There's something called phylogeny, evolutionary history of organisms. So looking at how are they related. So here, for example, this would be an evolutionary tree. Here are the different species. Over here, common ancestors. And over here, we're having, new branches in that tree. So evolutionary trees reveal the evolutionary history of species and sequence of speciation that gave rise to them. So here would be the common ancestor to rats and mice, here to humans and rats to birds. At this point, a speciation event occurred and the ancestral species split. So we can look at evolutionary trees, and phylogeny helps us see that. They show ancestor-descendant relationships, right? So these would be the ancestors, and then these would be the descendants. Now, with living things, this is guaranteed going to be a test question, guaranteed. The biggest categories of life, these are the big 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, eukarya. Okay, so bacteria, we're talking about prokaryotic. Archaea, which are prokaryotic but live in very extreme environments. Eukarya, eukaryotic cells, and under those, right, animals would be under here. Protists. Protists, when we did the pond water, you saw protists. Fungi, like mushrooms, mold, plants are in here, okay? Each tip branch out further to represent all species on Earth. An evolutionary tree with a branch for each of the millions of species of Earth would be incredibly complex. So monophyletic groups, those are groups that are closely related. Okay, so for example, these guys are more closely related than these guys. Okay, so monophyletic group, members of monophyletic group share a common ancestor. These guys share a common ancestor, and the group contains all of the descendants of that ancestor. So how do we construct evolutionary trees? How do we do that? There's different ways. So Linnaeus, when we categorized with taxonomy all living things, we would look at morphology, the shape. For example, a lion versus a hyena versus a bear versus wolves, okay? So lions and hyenas are more closely related, okay? Or lions are more closely related to hyenas than they are to bears. And bears are more closely related to wolves than lions and hyenas, okay? So we can look at their structure, the phylogeny, okay? The morphology, not phylogeny. So for example, lions and hyenas, retractable claws, yes. Black bears and wolves, retractable claws, no, okay? Number of chambers in the ear bone, 3, 3, 1, 1. Does the penis have a bone? Yes, that's a real thing, right? Here with the lion and the hyena, no. With the bear and the wolf, yes. So if we're looking at shape, structure of the body, it shows that these are more closely related and these are more closely related, okay? But now we have even a stronger tool. Now we have DNA. And we can look at DNA sequences. Remember A, T, C, G, right? The blue's A, pink is T, da, da, da. 2 species. Look how closely their genetic code is. The more closely related the 2 species, the more identical their DNA is. What? Yes. So look at these 2 species. Again, the pink is the T. Look how closely related these 2 are. And these 2 are. So this one is more closely related to this one than this one, okay? And we can see that. So now with DNA technology, we really can see how closely related species are. It says by comparing how similar the DNA sequences are between 2 groups, we can estimate how long it's been since they shared a common ancestor. We can see even, again, how closely related they are. Species 1 and 2 are more similar to each other than they are to either species 3 or 4. This is because they probably share a more recent common ancestor. The more similar their DNA, the more closely 2 species related. So we can look at that and we can create evolutionary trees. Now, similar structures don't always mean similar ancestry. And that's talking about what's something called convergent evolution, okay? So look at a bat. A bat has a wing and an insect has a wing. But and the reason they have wings is not because of a common ancestor. Bats are mammals and they are more closely related to humans. Insects are insects, okay? So then it's like, how come they have wings and they have wings? It has to do with evolutionary pressures and something called convergent evolution, okay? And these features, they're called analogous features. So the bat wing is really, it's an arm, okay? It's a modified arm versus the insect wing is a wing. It's a totally different structure, okay? And they both can fly, but that has nothing to do with common ancestry. So it says bats and wings share a wingless common ancestor. Okay, here, wingless common ancestor, suggesting that a bat and insect wings evolve independently. So we can look at that. Okay, so they're called it's called convergent evolution, and those traits are called analogous traits. Analogous features that are produced by convergent evolution. So wings and wings, but has nothing to do with a common ancestor, versus homologous traits. Now, with homologous traits, the reason there's similarities is because it does come from a common ancestor. So features are inherited from a common ancestor. So our bone structure in our hand and the bat's bone structure, they're homologous. The one bone, two bone, bunch of bones, right? If you remember from the video that you guys saw, they are homologous, and that word homologous means they came from a from a common ancestor. How do you know whether traits are homologous or analogous? Well, DNA analysis, right? DNA will show us who's more truly closely related. So lastly in this chapter is macroevolution versus micro. So all the species and all the species diversity, how did they come about? When we talk about speciation, like one species becoming another, that's microevolution. Micro meaning small, so speciation events. So like allopatric, sympatric speciation, that's a micro. But then how about all the different birds, right? How about all the different insects? That's macroevolution. So looking at it at a much larger scale, okay? So macroevolution above the species level. So for example, here's a picture of the Grand Canyon. Amazing, right? This river created the whole canyon, and it affects the organisms that live there, plant and animal. Okay, so just a stream of water running over rocks can create Grand Canyon. Accumulated microevolutionary changes can lead to dramatic macroevolutionary changes. So micro, from a species to a species, micro. Macro is the whole tree, looking at it all, okay? And we can ask, how does this happen? Does it happen quickly? Or does it happen very slowly? The answer is both are correct. When we think of evolution and when we think of geologic time, we're thinking of millions and millions of years. Millions of years sounds like a really long time, okay? And that can happen with macroevolution, gradual change. But microevolution can happen too, where we have speciation events happening like that, okay? So like sympatric speciation. So the tempo of evolution, it could take a very long time, millions of years, gradual change, evolution by creeps. The pace of evolution occurs gradually in incremental steps. So we can see that. The fossil record shows that that has happened. Also, we can have bursts, you know, it says evolution by jerks, bam, bam, right? And long periods of relatively little evolutionary change and then punctuated bursts of rapid change. That's called punctuated equilibrium. And in reality, you know, when I was in college way back when, not that long ago, okay, we talked about gradualism, we talked about punctuated equilibrium, and it's like, it's either this or it's that. No, it's truly both things are happening. All right, so we're going to stop here and we have one more video.